Ah, tiredness, but also a sense of completeness. That's how I feel right now, because at this point, the DFuxa reviews and plays 7DRL 2023 has all the videos for all the successful reviews. Starting with the first one based review of Chickadee's Dungeon, all the way down to the low scoring 7DRL the Crossmaster. And while I'm basically not done with these reviews just yet, because I do plan to actually go through the failed ones as well, I feel this is like a good point basically to like, throw another like sort of like, review of like the reviews type of video basically like, did before. Though this time, as opposed to like sort of reviewing the like, challenge itself, I'm more or less going to be reviewing myself as a reviewer. And sort of like give some insights basically for those basically looking to possibly do a 7DRL in 2024. If I manage to show up in that one as a judge, so to speak. So you basically have some insights about how I basically think about stuff and like, how I basically viewed stuff and such. So I suppose we'll get to this in a moment. Let's just like, put a little cut in here. I'm just going to try and break this up into multiple parts, so bear with me. Before breaking anything down, I figured there's one really important note that I basically have to like basically throw to you guys here. Because it is indeed important to basically keep in mind if you're basically looking at the judges of like, 2024 for 7DRLs. And that basically corresponds to the number of reviews I basically did during the 7DRL 2023 like, challenge. I myself basically did a total of 94 reviews. And for those who like, understand like, how many reviews that basically is in like, the grand scheme of things, there's essentially 181 successfully like, submitted like games to the 7DRL 2023. And if you want to be like really technical, a couple of games like Random Die Here and Code Talker, those are games that like no one could basically review because they couldn't get them to work. But just going by this number, 181 here, I'll note that basically that corresponds to being just a little bit under 52% of the games in total. And that basically means that in terms of my reviewing of like the the games of this year, I basically reviewed a little bit over half of them. And that is kind of important because if you're looking at the judges, there's a good chance that I'll be one of the judges. I may not review this many games in the next year, but I'm probably going to review quite a bit of them. And, my like, judging is probably going to affect your game as a result of that. Now, it's worth noting as well, part of the reason I basically reviewed as much as I basically did is because no one else basically reviewed as much as I basically did. The closest like people who basically came like, to match me were basically like, Goten here, Samuel Delek, Uzaz, Executor. The others basically all had like, less than 4% of like the total games reviewed. And it's possibly may like do more next year, or we might have like, another reviewer like me basically pop up who will basically do a lot more reviews. And let's just say basically I'm basically knocked down to like 25% of the games basically reviewed by me. That still means there's basically a 1 in 4 chance like that I'm going to be reviewing your game if like so. Just to keep that in like mind. All right, so with that basically out of the way, let's get into the actual numbers that really matter to you guys. So bear with me one more time basically here to basically stop this. So how did Davian rate games for this review? Here's basically a breakdown of the various categories I was basically asked to review under, and the amount of 1s, 2s, and 3s I basically gave under each category. You can basically see that all these numbers will basically add up to like 94 here, so 8, 35, 51 equals 94, 55, 39 equals like, 94, etc. And you basically get sort of a glimpse basically like, my sort of thought process between like, how I basically review things. Although I basically gave fairly high reviews for a lot of games in completeness and aesthetics, I gave a lot of 1s basically for like, fun. I was a little bit more balanced basically for, innovation and scope. And I was a little bit more extreme with Roguelikeness basically, because not a whole lot of 2s, but a whole lot of 1s or 3s. And for the most part, I'm both like, a little bit surprised, but not really surprised at all. Now that it's like, 2020 like vision basically on this stuff. Initially I thought I was being like, a lot more like, critical when it basically came to like, innovation, but it turns out I was being like fairly balanced with that like, category. And the same could be, basically be said for scope here as well. And I thought I was being a lot more like, balanced with like Roguelikeness, but it turns out I was being a lot more extreme with it. So, there's not much I can basically, really say about that. Now, here's basically a question to basically like, follow up with like, all these numbers basically put out here. Is this basically how I'm going to judge basically in like, 2024? And the answer is probably like yes, with some modifications. I'll note that basically when it comes to these categories, fun, innovation, and scope, I'm probably going to be like judging it the same. But I'm probably going to be a little bit more critical when it basically comes to completeness or aesthetics. And I'll note that this is basically because I wasn't really like, being all that harsh for those categories. And because Kazurachi, the owner of Grid Stage Games, he basically pointed out that when it basically comes to like instructions, and it's basically in regards to like, approachability, which is basically something I suggested in like the last video. But he suggested that like, if it's basically like, coming down to like instructions for a lot of his games, and they're like not being there, I really should be knocking down like games for incompleteness basically for it. And I have to agree with that like, somewhat, because if if the controls basically are like, obscured for that sort of like thing, or like not well written, then it really does affect like my ability to basically play the game. I basically like, randomly like, hit keys to try and figure out key combinations for like stuff, or I basically have to like, go back into like, the instructions, like read them over again to try and figure out what I have to basically do. And that's like, gonna basically take away from your completeness next time in like, 2024. I'm also gonna be a lot more like, brutal when it basically comes to like, aesthetics. And as you can basically see here, if you're gonna have like, blue ASCII on a black background, I'm gonna dock you points for it. And I think that's basically fair to basically say, because, well, it's basically Darren Gray basically like notes a good like, ASCII set will get higher marks than like, poor tile set. But in my mind, if you have blue ASCII on a black background, that is a poor tile set. It's hard to read, so you should be docked points for it. Now, there is one category down here to basically note that like, it's a little bit separate from like the rest of this stuff here, and that's basically like, Roguelikeness. And I'm gonna basically have like, one like special like, segment basically just for that. So one final pause and we'll jump into it. So I'll give a brief warning before I basically jump into the next part here. If you don't like definitions or discussions about what a roguelike is or isn't, skip this next part, because it's basically corresponding to like the fact that I basically have to judge a category specifically on this like criteria. And unlike basically the other like, parts of like the categories of like, completeness, aesthetics, innovation, scope, and fun, I can at least like, give you some thoughts basically about like, the definition of like, what a roguelike basically is or isn't. And it may not be like the same for like everyone else, but we're basically talking to the guy who basically did like, half of the games in 2023. It feels like it's really important to basically give like my perspective basically, so we can basically go from there. So first things first, here's basically sort of like a written like, blurb about like, how I basically came to the conclusions for like scoring a lot of these games. Essentially, I have like, a primary judging criteria, a secondary judging criteria, and a tertiary judging criteria. And I didn't actually follow this list basically per se when I was basically like, judging games, but it does very much correspond to basically how I basically sort of thought through where a game was basically going to get like, 1, a 2, or a 3. Or if I was basically going to contact Darren and be like, hey, this game should not belong here, get rid of it, so to speak, for like, other people basically to review. And on the by the way, you can actually, contact Darren Gray himself if you want to basically ask him this. But yes, if you basically didn't have a pursuit duration for your game, there's a good chance basically Darren got a comment from me about it. And same permadeath. Now, I will note by the way, if I was basically like, referred to the basically judge your game, I didn't say anything, but just from like those like games that I was like, you know, the first or second person basically judging them, I probably did send a comment to Darren. So just to sort of like belate that point. Alright, so I'm not basically going to go over these like, you know, too much, but you basically like, you can see like, you know, how I basically like, you know, come to like, you know, the scoring for a lot of stuff here. So I'm not basically going to like, you know, start out here. I basically check to see, does this game actually sort of like qualify to be actually in a challenge, for example. And I basically like, you know, check to see if it's got like, you know, proc gen. Does it have like, you know, some sort of like, you know, semblance of permadeath? Does it have like, you know, enough complexity to basically be here or, you know, not be here? And I also basically check to see like, you know, how basically close is it to like, you know, another genre as opposed to like, you know, being a roguelike. Though that didn't really come up for this like challenge, so you basically ignore this one for now. But anyhow, this is sort of like talk about the other three here. To basically like, you know, sort of relate this point, proc gen is not randomization. Proc gen is basically the idea of like, you know, map being like, you know, created from scratch each time. And it basically like, you know, corresponds to having like, you know, different layouts of the map basically to like, you know, follow. And prevent basically like, you know, a lot of like memorization of like maps. And this is something I basically consider to be really important basically to have. So keep this in mind. Permadeath, not a whole lot basically to say about that as well. If you basically die, then you should just restart the game like, you know, from scratch. Or at least you should start from the beginning. And then complexity, that'd be like, you know, is there lots of items basically to like play with? Is there a lot of interaction like the mouse can basically do with you, etc., etc. Now, once you basically have like these basic qualifiers out of the way, I basically move on to actually like, you know, properly judging your game at that point. And that's basically where like secondary judging basically comes into play. And I basically start to look at like, you know, how realistic is this game basically like, you know, on the face value of it, or it's basically like, you know, more something else. That's basically like unrelated to like realism in general. And this be something as simple as like, you know, how big is like, you know, the unit you're basically controlling here? Is it like a single dungeon character running around through a dungeon, hacking, slashing everything in his way? Or is it basically like, you know, a small band of like troops? Maybe like, you know, say 4 Steam Marines basically run around a ship, blasting away like the enemies that are basically on board? Or perhaps it's basically something like, you know, more akin to like Xenonauts, where you basically have like, you know, 16 like, you know, soldiers basically running around in like a squad-based manner to like different sections of the map, clearing out all the baddies. Size does matter when it basically comes to like a roguelike. So if you have like, you know, too many like, you know, sort of pieces right basically running around, there's a good chance basically gonna like, you know, dock you points for it. I'm not really sure what I basically would say like is like, you know, a good like, you know, maximum to aim for, but basically to keep it in like, you know, line with like, you know, some like, you know, basic thinking. If you ever play like FTL Fast and Light, having like a single ship with like a few moving bodies basically inside is probably like a like, you know, a good indication of like, you know, what's basically like, you know, proper for like a roguelike, more than not. After I basically get to that, you know, twitch reaction versus analytical thinking. So am I basically thinking a lot my moves basically through, or am I basically just reacting to stuff as like I go along? There's not a whole lot basically to say here, but basically roguelikes are like, you know, are more about thinking than they are about like, you know, fast reaction and like gameplay. And you may see like a lot of like, games like say Bind of Isaac basically have like a lot more like, you know, bang bang shooty type of bits and stuff like that. But the really good roguelikes are basically those that basically have you like, you know, planning out your moves a little bit. How they basically approach this situation, for example. And, you know, if you basically have that basically going on like in some like, you know, factor for your game, there's a good chance basically you'll be getting higher marks than not. At least for me. And, you know, that basically like falls into like, you know, decision making. So do you have like a character playing like type of system? Do you have like any tactical play? Do you have item strategizing? Now, a lot of games basically do have like this like, you know, sort of component in some way. Like they might have like an upgrade system where you basically like, you know, level up and you basically get like, you know, your random choice of upgrades. Maybe you have like, you know, some sort of like, you know, leveling plan for like your character where you basically have like, you know, 5 upgrades of like, you know, strength and armor. Then you have like these like special skills and stuff like that. Basically like a town system, such like Tales of Magic or whatever. Like stuff basically to like, you know, basically work with as like you like plan out your character and like move on. And then, is there any persistence between runs? Now, I'll throw a little tidbit here. This is the one factor I basically use for distinguishing if a game is basically a roguelike versus a roguelike. And I can basically like, you know, deal with the fact that like some like, you know, roguelikes might be like more like action based than not. But if you basically have like some sort of like, you know, persistence between runs, you're not really basically in roguelike land anymore. You're basically in like the roguelite land at that point. So just keep that in mind. And that basically corresponds to like do you have like unlocks or upgrades basically for your like your characters basically. So do you unlock new characters as you basically play your game, or are you basically upgrading like the same character over and over again? And then are you accessing content from past runs as well? So that too. All right, so once you basically get past like this part of judging, tertiary judging, and this is basically throw it out there. I'm not too much of like a purist when it basically comes to like games being turn-based. If you have like some semblance basically like decision making where like maybe you have like crypto-nickerousness where you basically like have like a sort of like time stop, time start, time stop, time start type of idea, that's fine by me. If you have like a pause and go system like FTL, that's fine by me. But I do like to basically see like some sort of like turn-based setup basically going on with my games I basically play with this genre. And I think that for most part, a lot of people basically are like the same like sort of mind with this as well. So keep that in mind. Jumping back up here, so permanent promises for actions that basically like corresponds to like do you have like a save and load system like of some sort? And this basically corresponds to like a lot of like these ideas where like say like you play like Tales of Machiel and you basically play in the adventure mode. I do actually consider adventure mode to be like still like a roguelike mode, by the way. It just has like extra lives, and that's fine by me. It'd be the same with like invisible ink, where you basically have like that like rewind system that works just as fine as well. The idea though is that like there has to be like some of a cost for it, so you can't basically like abuse it like indefinitely. So keep that in mind. It's basically like infinite saving and loading. There's like really like no contest in between like my sort of judgment just being like a roguelike or not. So just to throw it out there. Immersion. So when I basically wrote down immersion here, I'll note that I basically wrote this right here because I'm very much like a type of like kid when I basically like play these games, and I basically look at a game and feel like, am I basically that character in the screen, like hacking and slashing at monsters, or is it Bob? And am I controlling Bob basically move around and do stuff, or am I controlling myself as Bob move around and do stuff? Immersion is basically a big thing for me. And if you basically like don't have like this sort of like ability to like blend people basically into your game, it's probably not a roguelike. Just to throw it out there. And then finally, randomization. I do actually like judge people based on randomization. It's like judge a little bit later than like proc gen. If you basically have like the same levels like popping up all over the place, so you might have like say proc gen, but you might have like the same amount of like monsters basically appearing on the same like level. I don't really like that too much. I still acknowledge that it basically is a roguelike, but you can basically make them a little more random in that. All right, so that's just a like sort of brief overview of like how I basically judge roguelikes and stuff like that. I'll follow up with a conclusion here, but just bear with me one more like time. If you basically viewed this video and found it helpful, let me know. Primarily, I basically put this video out here so people basically looking to make games in like 2024 who may want to like do some extra like research on like judges, specifically me, can basically have like, some idea of like how do they want to like make their games and like go about like avoiding like certain like items in their games or including basically like certain others. And it's also important, I guess, to like those basically looking down the future, how do like they basically judge the games back in like this time. I don't think I basically necessarily correspond to like all the reviewers. I'm pretty sure there's a lot more who are a lot more like hardline on like games being like turn-based or not. But hopefully like this will be helpful, regardless. Now I basically do plan to jump into like the the failed entries that like didn't like really make it into like this like challenge. But other than that, this is basically it for like the successful like videos and like videos basically corresponding to them. Hope you guys basically like enjoyed the playlist thus far, and keep watching. Until we get to the next one, take care.